This is the best way to play Torb in Overwatch 2. Torb is picked for its added sustain and chunkiness in comparison to its hit scan counterpart Cassidy. If you can nail down the easier parts of his kit, then the biggest skill curve comes with landing his Cheeto shots consistently in order to keep up with the damage that heroes like Cassidy or Soldier will be constantly outputting. Put your turret on flanks or on off angles, overload when dove, ult to zone space, and land those shots. Torb's weapon, the Flaming Hot Cheetos, makes TORBJÖRN fire rivets every 0.55 seconds, dealing 70 damage per shot and travelling at 70 meters per second. Torb can also eject molten metal in a short range, dealing up to 125 damage per blast, taking up 2 ammo per shot. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that shotguns are good at close range and not so good at other ranges, so the only time you'll be using your alternate fire will be in close quarter combat to consistently land a good chunk of damage, especially against tanks where you can guarantee every pellet will land. You could be ballsy and trying to one-shot heroes up close with your standard Cheeto shot, but to me, that's the equivalent of trying to one-shot someone as Widow in close range. Sure, it looks and feels good when you do it, but it's not practical, it's less consistent, and it's just taking unnecessary risk. Unless you're up against small hitboxes like Genji or Tracer, meaning the spread of your shotgun is less forgiving, or you're up against slow moving targets in close range, like a Widow scoped in, there's no real reason to not use a shotgun in these kind of scenarios. As for other occasions, due to the inconsistency of your primary fire, you'll also be spending your time spamming down main. This certainly doesn't mean that you can't or shouldn't contest angles, because you still definitely should, but just note that you may struggle a little bit more, because your Cheetos are harder to land than playing point and click simulator on hitscan. With that out of the way, the range and sightlines you want to be playing on Torb can vary wildly depending upon the enemy composition, just like with most mid-range heroes, as Barlow explains here.
His range variety, in other words, there is no one range to play with Torb. It's completely dependent on the map, completely dependent on the enemy composition, and really your composition as well. For example, if I'm playing Torb into snipers, I'm playing hyper short angles and basically playing to 1v1 them at close ranges if I can. If I'm playing Torb against like full dive, you're playing a spam hero. You're playing essentially a spam hero at long range. So he's a very flexible hero when it comes to range, a little bit like McCree.
So, for example, if you're playing against a long-range sniper composition on a map like Hollywood, I'd recommend taking the high ground in order to get a closer sight line on that Widowmaker. With smart cover usage, one Cheeto headshot, and that Widow is forced to stop peeking. However, up against a more flanker-based composition who have more lethality at shorter ranges, you're gonna need to be playing longer sightlines with cover. In a case like Hollywood Attack, utilising your turret and overload defensively, or pushing high ground as a team unit, are likely the calls to make here. Aside from that, practicing your accuracy with Torb's primary fire is going to drastically increase the amount of value you get from him. I'm once again recommending IOStox's aim trainer, JPYHG, of which I have a nice cameo in. Torb's first ability, B-Tech Aimbot, makes Torb deploy a self-building turret with 225 HP, dealing 56 DPS in a 40 meter attack range with a 3-second cast time paired alongside a 10-second cooldown. He also has his infamous hammer that deals 55 damage per hit and heals his turret for 50 HP. There's two main uses to Torb's turrets. The first is to use it as a burglar alarm and a warning system similar to Symmetra's turrets, as Barlow explains here.
Turret is literally like a burglar alarm that alerts you that something on an angle is wrong. And not only is it a burglar alarm, it's a burglar alarm that takes a little hammer and whacks them in the shins. You see what this Hanzo has to do? There's Stormbow and he's half HP. You know, that's what turret's for. And you know he's there now. You have to decide what angle is most relevant.
Building off that bit at the end about choosing which flank to mark, just turret the flank that you think is going to be more commonly used, and try to place the turret with cover so it doesn't get easily destroyed. The second type of turret is to use it as an extra angle of damage, so going back to Blizzard World, this could be on the high ground, right behind where the enemy team are pushing. The reason why off-angle turrets are so useful is that the enemy team need to turn away from the front line in order to destroy it, meaning that damage from you and your team is more likely to land onto them. Not to mention, when your turret's at an angle, it's more likely to shoot HP rather than shields, meaning you actually gain ult charge from it. However, in terms of understanding why you should place your turret on these unorthodox off angles, and why angles are just good in general, here's top 500 Torb main Goblin explaining and applying the thought process behind turret angles.
So if you notice the way these turrets are positioned, they are positioned on really off angles that you wouldn't expect people to hold or take, just generally odd positions. The reason for this is because when the enemy team pushes in, you don't want the first thing they focus to be your turret. You want them to focus on your team, and while your team is being focused, your turret is helping with suppressing fire. If your turret stays alive for most of the fight and is shooting for most of the fight, that's how you get the most value out of your turret, rather than it being destroyed initially and you have to wait a 10-second cooldown, because in 10 seconds your entire team can be wiped. Another reason for these turrets positions is the simple fact that it draws the enemy team's focus fire. If you're able to pull someone's attention from the team fight for 4 or 5 seconds and make that team fight a 6v5 or a 5v4 for just 4 or 5 seconds, that can be the difference between winning and losing a team fight.
Adding some nuance to this, you want to try and make sure that your turret isn't the first thing the enemy see, as they can more easily break the turret as a result. For instance, on Numbani second point defense, by placing your turret on top of the green bus, you technically have an additional angle, but as soon as the enemy team turn the corner, your turret is going to be the first thing the enemy team sees, and it's going to get destroyed pretty easily. Instead, if your team are holding by the green bus initially, tossing your turret by the coast side mega is much better. The turret has cover and can only be seen when the enemy team pushes forwards. It's also a 2-in-1 in that it also acts as a burglar alarm for any flankers coming through the left side, whilst also providing off-angle pressure. Now, in terms of choosing which one of the 2 turret playstyles to use, if the enemy team are running flankers like Tracer, Sombra, or Wrecking Ball, you should favour the burglar alarm type turrets. However, if the enemy team are running a more poker based composition, or one that doesn't really hard flank much, like Widow, Pharah, or Hanzo, you should favour the off-angle type of turrets. But regardless of which turret you go for, your turret should almost never be frontlining. You should also be adjusting the position of your turrets in accordance to what the enemy team are playing and where they're pathing. For example, if your turret isn't getting use at all, then reposition it in a different area. Before I end off this section, there's an unusual third use of turrets, which is to throw it and use it aggressively when taking a duel, using the turret as makeshift cover. For instance, if you're dueling a Cassidy on Route 66 third points, throwing a turret before you peek will provide you with 2 advantages. The first is that it acts as a distraction and splits attention away from you onto the turrets. And the second advantage is that it can provide you some temporary cover. Not to get too much into the micro as well, but this can also block Cassidy's Magnade if he chooses to throw it early. Torb's second ability, Angie Dwarf, makes Torb gain 100 additional overhealth and 30 to 40% buffs all around to his movement speed, fire rates, and reload times, all of which has a 5-second duration paired with a 10-second cooldown. Just like your turret, there's 2 main uses to your overloads, one of which is to use it defensively when getting dove, and the second is to use it aggressively when punishing rotations.
So overload is either 2 uses. It's either used as a defensive cooldown that you can utilize when you're being pressured, dove, or dueling, or it could be used as extra pressure. So if the enemy team is making an aggressive rotate or pushing into your team and you know that you're not going to need it as a defensive cooldown anytime in the next 5-10 seconds, press the E so you... right? So you can smack them in the mouth because you do a lot more damage when you're overloaded.
A visual example of both of these uses could be a Numbani first point defense, where if the enemy team decide to rotate through high grounds and push out onto you, especially if they're on a comp that lacks mobility, you can activate Overload to punish people walking out in the open. However, if they're running a standard dive comp, a defensive use of Overload would be to peel off a dive. This allows you to punish the enemy Winston, or whatever the dive tank may be, while simultaneously giving you more survivability. Another use of Overload, linking onto the last use of Torb's turrets, is to use it to gain an advantage in duels. Referring back to that root example, you could pop Overload against his Cassidy, who now needs 6 shots to kill you, whilst you have a slightly increased fire rate and movement speed over Cassidy. Do note that you do need to be able to aim your primary fire, which can still be difficult. Torb's ultimate, funny demonetized innuendo, makes Torb create pools of molten slag that deal 160 DPS to normal enemies, or 250 against enemies with armor. You have 5.5 seconds to deploy your Molten Core, and the ultimate has a 10-second duration. In terms of usage, one overlooked use is to zone and take space. This can commonly take the form in shooting your Molten Core behind the enemy team, so when your team pushes in, the enemy team are forced to back up into your Molten Core. For example, on Real to first point attack, you could push past this corner by shooting your Molten Core behind the enemy frontline, so they have to back up quickly, allowing your team to push past the corner. Alternatively, and what I think is an incredibly potent use of Torb's ultimate, is to not only zone the space that happens on the frontline, but to also zone the very important areas of the map around the frontline. This will most commonly take the form of high ground or flanks. For instance, on King's third point attack, you could zone all sets of high grounds. By zoning these spaces, heroes like Genji or Echo, or anyone with vertical mobility, can more easily take the high grounds. There's also using Molten Core defensively to zone the space around you, so heroes like Winston, Genji and Tracer can't get on top of you as easily. Combine this with your Overload and your turrets, and you can see why Torb has a great set of anti-dive tools at his disposal. Lastly, you ideally want to tie Molten Core in mid-fights, as Barlow explains here.
Ultimate usage is 100% mid-fight, 100% mid-fight. It doesn't have to be like, okay, we've already lost somebody, but like the fight commits, 3, 2, 1, Torb. Because it is very easy to kite out, very easy to play around, and it takes a little bit of setup, so you don't want to wait too long.
Moving on to the positional, playstyle, and compositional section of this guide. As talked about prior, Torb's overall playstyle hinges on what the enemy team will be running. If they're running short to medium range heroes, or heroes that you outrange, you're going to be playing like a sniper almost, still taking angles, but the ones you do take will have longer sightlines. A perfect example of this could be against a dive comp, where you outrange heroes like Sombra, Echo, Genji, Tracer, Doomfist and Winston, meaning you play your range as much as you can before they dive, and once they do dive, you pop your overload and should hopefully have a defensive turret set up. Make sure to be taking soft off angles instead of hard flanking against dive, a concept I talk about a lot in my Ashe and Cassidy guides. If however, you're playing against comps that do outrange you, mostly being the sniper stuff, then you're forced to play short sightlines, being creative with your turrets, and likely using most of your cooldowns aggressively to shorten the gap. And if you're playing somewhere in between, like in a poke brawl hybrid comp with heroes like Mei, Cassidy, Ramattra, Reinhardt, Soldier, and Sojourn, then those aggressive windows still apply. For example, on King's Row first points, if you're playing Torb in a brawl mirror, flanking through a hotel, fishing for a pick, and using your overload accordingly will likely be the best play. You could even toss your turret inside of the hotel, marking anyone who dares come through it. And that's it for the guides. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and if this video helped to raise your IQ, be sure to share it with your friends to also raise theirs. Until next time.